Okay, so I think it's about to set up. Okay, so we're called the Tiny Cupboard. Me and Amy started this kind of DIY scrappy cultural venue in Brooklyn, and we normally do events, of course, like in person. But in the past couple of months, we've been doing a lot of events online because we had to shut down our real life thing, and we have never done this. We've done an author event. We've done a few like philosophy author, nonfiction author events. We've never done like a fiction author event. And how this is going to work tonight is Laila's going to read a little bit from probably her new book, and that's Golden Poppies. And
Great.
nice, yes, I'm correct. And so you can read however much you want, whether that be 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever you feel like is a good amount. And then we'll just have a conversation about it. We can ask questions, we can make comments, and just kind of see where the conversation goes. Yeah, that's what we'll do. Thanks so much, Laila, for doing this. It's awesome to have you. And you can start whenever you want.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. My name is pronounced Laila. It's very common for people to say Laila, and it's not really a problem, but my mom thought it looked prettier that way. So, and I think she's right. It's very pretty. I thought I would just start at the beginning. I'm like, where do I start? I'll start at the beginning with the prologue. And yeah, I'll probably read the first chapter, the prologue and the first chapter, and then we can have whatever conversation we have. I have to say one thing about this prologue. I've had 2 people send it to me in the last week or 2 because of what's going on with the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement and the what I call police lynching. So it's, I don't know, it's just extra poignant to have my own words come back to me this week. I thought my education would protect us, like forged armor, too strong for the evils of hatred to penetrate, but I was wrong. Maybe every generation needs to believe they will end the trampling, as if it had not been thought of before. Without that certain and foolish hope, I don't believe we could have gone on. Chapter 1, Jordan. Chicago, Illinois, April 1894. Well, I guess I ain't never gonna see them beautiful poppies or look on Lizbeth's face again, Mama declared, looking straight at Jordan. Her dark brown eyes were glossy. She didn't bother to blink away her tears. Jordan's eyes matched her mother's. She stifled a protest, forcing down the urge to tell Mama she was wrong, that her appetite would come back along with her strength. But there was no point in fighting for a lie. Mama was dying and leaving Jordan forever. Invisible hands choked Jordan's throat tight. She sat on the bed by her mother, so close she felt her bony hip against her thigh. Her daughter Naomi stood near. For weeks, they'd searched in vain for something, anything that would stay in Mama's stomach. The devastating truth hiding in plain sight had finally been spoken. Mama took Jordan's hand, her shriveled thumb stroking the back of it. I had a very good life, a very good life. The Lord has blessed me more than I have a right to. I ain't afraid to go home. She sighed. I just wish I could see how it all turns out. Mama let out a weak laugh. Ain't I a foolish old woman? Grammy, no one would ever call you a fool, no, Naomi countered. You deserve everything you have and more. After working so hard for us all your whole life, you just get to rest. I'll be back with a tonic to ease your pains. Jordan was struck by Naomi's calm confidence. Her reserved daughter had somehow turned into this poised young woman. Naomi left her grandmother's bedroom. The click of the door echoed in the chamber. A dim ray of sun filtered through the lone window. It faced a narrow light well, a small gap between row houses that were built right next to one another. Mama's body had shrunk under her faded quilt. Jordan's gaze traveled across the various fabrics that kept her mother warm. disjointed parts of their lives stitched into a whole. The dress Mama had escaped in was at the center, the homespun plantation cotton still strong and whole, though many of the other fabrics had worn through over the years. Surrounding the rough, enduring material were blocks made from remnants of Samuel's trousers, Jordan's dresses, and Pop's shirts. Jordan stroked some of the colorful patches that skipped across the top of the quilt. Whenever a hole wore through, Mama cut a square from the best part of a grandchild's worn out shirt, so they can warm my spirit while asleep. Jordan rubbed the pieces of her children's clothes, reflecting on the days when they were young. She ached for the feel of Naomi's and Malcolm's precious little bodies in her arms. Jordan ran her finger over an embroidered red shoe. It was all that remained of the baby blanket Lisbeth Johnson had made for her more than 4 decades ago. A little girl trying to stitch her way into their family. As a child, Jordan used to imagine herself with a real pair of those bright red shoes, dazzling the sanctuary on Sunday mornings. The maroon dress Jordan had been married in had become the new binding for Mama's quilt 15 years ago. Mama had rejected every offer to make her a new quilt, saying she was going to sleep the rest of her days under the one that kept her warm for so long. Too soon she'd get her wish. Mama would take her last breath underneath the same comforter that covered Pops when he'd died 10 years earlier in this same room. Jordan picked up the treasured family Bible and rubbed the worn leather cover. Its thin pages were the first words she had ever read. The Lord's message of hope and faith had been a reliable source of comfort through her life. But in the months since her husband's sudden death, the words rang hollow. She'd recite them to soothe her Mama, but she didn't expect them to penetrate the pile of pain that covered her own soul. "Would you like me to read to you, Mama?" Jordan asked. "Oh, yes," Mama nodded with a satisfied smile. "You know just what I need." Jordan opened up the bookmark, swallowed hard, and continued where they'd last left off. Matthew 5. "No," Mama interrupted, "not that. My heart wants to hear Matthew 13. Jordan sighed. Mama was preaching to her through the good book. She turned the silky pages until she found the passage. Jordan took a sip of water and read in a hushed voice. Mama closed her eyes, a soft smile on her face as she listened to the parable of the sower. 13:3. And he spake of many things unto them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went forth to sow. And when he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the fowls came and devoured them up. Some fell upon stony places where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up because they had no deepness of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. But others fell onto good ground and brought forth fruit. Some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. Who hath ears to hear, let them hear. Jordan continued, knowing that Mama had chosen this passage to remind Jordan to be good soil for the word of God. Her voice choked up, but she kept going through the assertion that faith was like a mustard seed, small but mighty. Mama patted her hand, comforting the comforter. Jordan's faith had vanished into the August night with her husband's last breath. They'd been preparing for bed when Booker called for her. She'd found him splayed on the ground against his wardrobe. His brown eyes, round and panicked, conveyed in an instant that he was leaving this earth. She knelt by him, straightened his body, and took his hand. She did her best to provide comfort in his last moments, tears streaming from her eyes. She kissed his cheek and whispered, thank you," into his ear. She rubbed his forehead and patted his chest as he struggled to breathe. She hadn't called for Naomi or Mama. Out of kindness or selfishness, she didn't know. It had just seemed right to be alone with her husband as he passed over. She stayed by him until the warmth left his beautiful brown skin, and her own heart was left cold. Now, Mama was being taken away from her. God was testing Jordan, and unlike Job, she was failing. When Mama was snoring softly, Jordan crept away from her bedside. Naomi pounced with a demand before Jordan could sit down on their worn but comforting couch. Mama, write to Lizbeth. Ask her to come before Grammy passes over, Naomi urged. Jordan smiled at her daughter. At 19 years old, Naomi had stepped past childhood, but the echo of it was still on her face. Her training as a nurse was a blessing in this painful time. Naomi had finished school just before the turn of the year from 1893 to 1894, but hadn't secured a full-time position yet because they'd agreed to move to Oakland. A transition that would be delayed now that Mama's stomach couldn't keep any food down. Malcolm, Jordan's 23-year-old son, had studied to be a lawyer, but worked as a Pullman porter like his father before him. Last fall, he'd been assigned to the Chicago-Oakland route. Soon after, he'd begun making the case for them to move west, asserting that a fresh start at life would be good for Jordan's spirits. The bleak February had caused her to agree. Resistance must have shown on Jordan's face because Naomi argued, "You heard her, Poppies and Lizbeth. Grammy wants to see Lizbeth before she passes. The least you can do is ask. Malcolm leaves for Oakland in the morning. He can deliver a letter. She lives near the place he stays, right?" Jordan nodded. She felt Naomi's eyes on her, waiting for a reply. "I'll consider your suggestion," Jordan responded. That was all she could agree to at the moment, though she had to decide quickly. Malcolm would leave for work before sunrise. She'd need to write that letter tonight if he would be the bearer of their sad news. Her chest clenched as she imagined the words she would have to put to paper. "Your Maddie, my mother, is dying. Please come. Her deepest sadness is that she will not be with you one last time before she leaves this earth. I understand it is a great inconvenience to travel 2,000 miles to visit with an old woman you haven't seen in decades, but it would mean so much to her and to me if you can manage it. If you cannot come, will you please write a note of farewell?" Tears were streaming down Jordan's face when she sat at her desk to write to Lizbeth Johnson. Naomi was right. She would push aside her own desires to make this appeal for Mama. But either response from Lizbeth was fraught. Rejecting the request would feel like an insult, but a visit from Lizbeth would be an imposition. Jordan didn't relish the idea of sharing this time with a white woman she hadn't seen in more than 20 years. But for Mama, she would face one or the other. Chapter 1.
All right. Thank you. That was lovely.
Thank
Very
you.
vivid. I feel like I was in that world.
Oh, nice.
Mhm.
Nice.
Thanks for reading.
Yeah, thank you.
That's the first time I've read it out loud. I mean, except to myself in my room as I'm trying to figure out what I'm writing. So thank you guys.
Awesome. So we're going to open up to any kind of questions. It doesn't have to be directly about the book, but just kind of anything. Does anyone want to start? I have a question. Well, Barbara, you're muted if you're trying to say something.
I was thinking about saying something, but I'll let you go first.
Okay. So what do you think about the importance of like interracial friendship, like during our time right now?
Oh, right now. I think it's essential, right? Like, I think it's the most important way that we can be honest and tell the truth with each other. Ideally, if you're close enough friends, you can tell each other your truth and learn and grow together. I think the whole process of my life, like I'm trying to figure out where it starts and I don't even know where it starts, but I've just come to realize how differently people are socialized in the United States. And so the frame I put it around it is that the United States was built as a caste system that gave systemic privilege to white, Christian, able-bodied, wealthy, straight men. And it's baked into our society. And then over time, we've been working on expanding who it is we consider a citizen, who gets the full rights of citizenship. And so depending where you are in the continuum of all those things, you have a very different experience of living in the United States. And so being honest about that with one another and how it feels to like move through the world in whatever body you occupy and whatever social position you occupy, I think will be one of the only, building empathy, I think, is one of the only ways we can get ourselves past the pain that we're in.
Mm. For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Barbara, you were going to say something?
Well, I was just going to ask if there's going to be another book, if there's going to be a fourth, because
I'm
you
working
left
on
it
number
hanging.
4 right now. My intention is actually to bring them all the way to the 2000s in Berkeley.
Okay, great.
So I'll just keep going. So my next point of view characters are May and Naomi, and I'm outlining it right now and just starting to write it. So we're still in Oakland. So we'll stay in Oakland and Berkeley. And you know, it's interesting, like as a writer, like why I'm called to write what I write, I don't fully understand. And yet, so my children went to a school called Malcolm X in Berkeley. They started there in 2000. And I'm married to a woman, and it's not going to be my story exactly at all, not even close. But the way the story is going to unfold is that, like, I was worried my children would have a hard time because they had 2 moms, right? That because they were at the cutting edge of being people who had 2 moms in school. And then when I got there and I got to the school's totally, at that point, was really multiracial and multi-class. And what I realized is those poor Black boys, like they're the ones who are going to have a very hard time getting through the school system and getting what they need. And I could just see this happen between kindergarten and 3rd grade. And these, like, there's this moment when I went on the 5th grade field trip, and these kids were kind of amazing, like they really could work together really amazingly well and like be students together. But then when it was time to like socialize, they definitely broke up by class and race. And this is 5th grade, right? And the data show that like already by 2nd or 3rd grade, these kids are starting to separate by class and race. And what I realized was that my daughter, that daughter's very Aryan, that daughter's very white. And so she and her white friends, you know, they were talking about like My Little Pony or something. Like they were just, you know, playing with their little horsey things, right? They're 5th grade, but they were still kind of innocent. And I mean, literally, I go to the other table and it's all these young African-American girls that are sharing stories of seeing their relatives be shot.
Oh my God.
And I was like, oh God, no wonder these kids, I mean, it's just, we're asking, it's just insane what we're asking them to bridge. So I think I was just fascinated by like all, and then of course there were kids that were adopted and from all around the world and kids that, you know, different races. And so it was like, wow, how do we expect all these kids to come together and try to be one community? But how did they get here? And so I think all the characters in my books are going to end up getting to that school as the descendants of these characters that I'm writing about now.
That's amazing.
Oh,
Yeah. That's like amazing to tell a story, like to tell a story throughout history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And take these moments of systemic oppression or these moments that are like what's baked into our society. And then for me, it's about a mother facing this issue on behalf of their child or with their child and somehow finding faith. And you can tell that, you know, spirituality and faith is in all my books is a big theme. And how do you have faith in a better tomorrow, right? Like it's just over and over and over again. Yeah. And to watch how systemic racism just traveled across this nation and got baked into laws and, even like most people don't know it, but like, the most, not even that affluent neighborhood, just a nice neighborhood in Oakland, was whites only in Oakland in the 20s, right? And so it's still like, you look at a map of the Bay Area and you're like, oh, right, all those housing laws that Dr. King and other people fought against, it was everywhere. It wasn't just in the South, but we project a lot of the racism in America onto the South.
For sure, for sure.
No, and then, my third book, this book is about a paper wife. So this is about looking systemically at how Chinese Americans were treated in the Bay Area and in the United States, right? As Angel Island. So like and so it's not like, and California racism is just different than what we might think of as Southern racism.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
How do you think historical fiction like helps us understand the world, or like helps us even relate to it?
Yeah, I think it just helps us know how we got here, and helps us understand why there's so much maybe anger or frustration baked into particular cultures or people. And to notice like the mechanisms of it, right? It's just, it's very painful, but it's also just super interesting. And it is the same thing over and over again. So it's a lot of tension around getting free labor or reduced price labor. So that's the story over and over again. I firmly believe that racism and sexism are all tools of classism. And so when you want free labor, you open up your border and you bring people in. And then when there's too much labor, then you shut the border. And like there's a goal also to keep people insecure, afraid. So they'll work for, less money, afraid to fight for their own rights, that kind of thing. So it's just kind of interesting to watch that It's in Golden Poppies. It's so weird when you write other books and you forget, you're like, is this the book? And so in Golden Poppies, they're having a conversation about child labor in the 1890s and 1910s. And it wasn't until the 1930s that we considered child labor like unconscionable. Wow. It's like, wow, that's just so, like, it just seems so insane to me that child labor was a thing everybody was arguing about. But like even my characters were like, well, how are the children going to live if they don't work? So it's just like, oh, right. And one of the moms is like, hey, these children shouldn't be working in a factory. Like, I get why they would work on a farm, but inside all day, that's just wrong for children, So we have come along, or we just have a different sensibility. So to see what we inherit around that sensibility and how,
What do you think we're going to look at like 100 years from now and just be like, how did we do that?
Okay, I had a great moment when I went skiing in the mountains that are about 2.5 hours from here with, there were 3 families, my family and 2 other families. And somehow when we were up there, 2 of the children learned that their great or great-great, probably great-great or great-great grandparents, basically their families owned slaves. And they just, they were crying and they couldn't believe it. And we thought we were good people. And so we had this conversation about that. And I said, it's that's what they were born into. And that in some ways, particularly yellow crocus is what I talk about. Like, we're each born into this system and we didn't choose our social location. We didn't choose the system. We didn't create the system, but we can be aware of the pain of the system and our choice into doing what we can to lessen the pain of other people. So what I said is, so they were just born into the system and they perpetuated it or didn't. We don't really know what they did with the system they were born into. And I'm pretty confident that in 100 years, people will say, what do you mean my great-great grandmother got in a car and spewed carbon into the air just so they could drive to the mountains and put these things on their feet and slide down a mountain? Are you kidding me? Really? So I'm not even sure it's going to be our great grandchildren. You know, I mean, I just between that time and now, I'm like, is it okay for me to fly? Completely unethical for me to fly ever again? Like, I don't know. I'm really struggling with it, but I'm born into a society where I fly and I drive and I value what I get from traveling. Do I want to give up that? I don't know. I like the food I get from other places, right? Like mangoes. They don't grow mangoes where I live.
That's a great insight.
Yeah, so I think it's a pretty apparent one now. It wasn't as apparent. I feel kind of clever that I thought of it 12 years ago or however long. It was 20 years ago. It was a while ago. Yeah. So Barbara, you've read my books?
I have not read your first one yet, but I've read all your other ones.
You haven't read Yellow Crocus?
Oh no, I thought
That's my
that was your first one. Your second one then.
Oh yeah, Living Right. Yeah. This is my little my poor stepchild. This is the book that my publisher didn't publish and I wanted it published, and so it's self-published. And I love my poor little stepchild book, Living Right, but yeah, it doesn't have very not many people have read it.
I'm going to. It's on my list.
Yay, thank you.
But I had to read Golden Poppies first.
Nice.
What's the next one going to be called?
I don't know, but I imagine I'm going to keep some sort of seed or flower theme, but we'll find out. Yeah, it hasn't popped up yet. The Golden Poppies, that one was like, I didn't think of the poppies for the title, but it was pretty obvious. But so far, the next one is set. It starts in 1915 and it goes to 1918. I'm pretty sure it's going to end in 18. And what I'm loving about that one, I am super researching birth control and the birth control movement and how people, I mean, it was illegal, right? So you weren't supposed to talk about birth control. And there's this thing in the newspapers, they advertise French tonics to keep women regular. And I've learned those were basically abortifactants, right? So it was to try to bring on your period. So I was like, wow, it's so interesting, this kind of underground thing that people were doing around birth control.
Wow.
And how, in some ways, we owe our whole society to the birth control movement. Like, it just, without that and women controlling their fertility and parents deciding how many children to have, or humans deciding how many, you know what I mean? It's like, wow, right. That changes everything.
Right.
So what do you think about what's going on like right now in terms of like protests and like everything?
Yeah. You know, when these things come around, it's both exceptionally painful because I can't believe we're still here. And at this moment, it is impressive how many people are standing up and how many people are thinking about how it is we need to reform policing and the mass incarceration system. So I decided to write Mustard Seed, which is looking at the rise of incarceration as a way to get free and reduced price labor after the Civil War. I'd heard about chain gangs. So I knew it kind of in theory, but not really in practice how it worked. And when you learn about it, like it's obscene, like really obscene how much people were being used for free labor and being used, like judges and justices of the peace would go get people and arrest them, Black men. 90% of them were Black men. Well, 90% were men and 90% of those were Black men. And then the rest were women. And so our policing is just based on that system. And we have to just be super honest about that. I was sitting in my driveway and I heard Brian, oh my God, I'm gonna space his last name. He wrote Just Mercies, Brian.
Oh yeah.
Stevenson?
Yeah, Brian Stevenson. So I'm sitting in my driveway and I'd written Yellow Crocus, but I hadn't written something else yet. And I've been thinking a little bit about a sequel. And he says, it's better to be rich and guilty in the United States than poor and innocent on this NPR interview. And I snarkily think to myself, oh, you had to go to law school to learn that? And I mean, I'm just like, I can't even believe. And then as soon as I heard myself think that, I thought, oh my God, that's not the country I want to be living in. I want to be living in a country and accepting the fact that being poor and innocent, you're screwed. Yeah. So I just was like, okay, I need to look a little more at that. Like, how am I living in a country where being poor and innocent is the wrong end to be on, right? So, yeah, so that's how I got the information for that book or got me going on that book. And so I just think as more and more Americans learn this history and see how it works. And 13th, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie 13th. So, I mean, I just by coincidence, not coincidence, I mean, it's the same thing. Like the start of Mustard Seed is the 13th Amendment, because I realized, oh, right, baked into our Constitution is the recipe for getting free and reduced price labor. And so that's how it all started during the Reformation. Like, okay, here's a way to get free and reduced price labor. Let's make it illegal to walk down the street. Yeah. So, and I do like that idea of like, you know, racism isn't growing, it's just being videoed, right? We're just seeing it. And so police brutality isn't increasing, it's just being captured on film.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah, and then to just have lots of people outraged about it and be like, no, this cannot be the nation I live in.
Right.
I think is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So you talk about free and reduced price labor. You've mentioned it a few times, and maybe it taking different forms throughout history.
Yeah.
Where do you see that taking place now? Like, where do we see this kind of modern day slavery?
Right. It's definitely with the undocumented people, and like the level at which having people who are here that are undocumented means they're afraid to like ask for services, and you know there's wages that don't get paid and all these things because they aren't comfortable, you know, going anyone and getting any help. They're often paying into Social Security, but they're not going to get Social Security. So we have this very large group of people that are undocumented, who will work for low wages, and companies profit from it, benefit from it. And it always feels like it's almost like a kabuki, right? Because people know they're working for these companies, but the companies get away with it, and the companies are profiting off this work, or these laborers. But the laborers, if they stand up and ask for any help, those companies, will often just call ICE and get them deported, right? So, and yeah, so a lot of the food we eat, a lot of the clothes we wear. One other way I think we also get, so I'm one of those people, like, I'm not like super educated about this, but I'm one of those people that basically believes I guess I'm like Angela Merkel, like borders need to be open to people and goods or not open to people and goods. But to open your border to goods, but not people, means you're using the less expensive labor, but you're getting the resources of that labor. So even things like closing our borders in the way that we have gives us access to free and reduced price labor, so that the people that are sewing our clothes, if they're not sewing our clothes in the United States, they're sewing them somewhere else, they're not getting the protection of the laws that we say we should, that we believe. If we should have it in this country, the people sewing our clothes should have it as well, right?
Right.
So globalization gets us free and reduced price things by its definition.
Interesting.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is.
Huh.
And it's not that I don't believe in globalization. I actually am someone who likes globalization, but then people should get to move. because
Right.
that's
Yeah.
part of what helps,
Yeah.
balance that out.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions or comments or thoughts from anyone?
Well, I have learned a lot from your book, so I appreciate it. I love
Yay.
having characters bring history alive.
Thank you. I appreciate
Very
that.
helpful to me. I learned a lot.
Yay. Thank you. I really appreciate that. How did you find them, Barbara?
A friend of mine is in a different book club, and they read The Yellow Crocus.
Mm-hmm.
I read whatever their book club reads as well. So I read
Yeah.
that book and I love that. And then my book club said, let's do The Mustard Seed.
Oh,
And I
nice.
started reading The Mustard Seed and I said, I know these characters. I know these people. And then we had a talk with you. You came on.
Oh,
came
right. Yeah.
Zoomed with us or
Yes.
FaceTime with us. So
Yeah. That's great.
it was just coincidental, but it was a wonderful.
You bring up a good point, Barbara. Like I agree. Like the characters bring history alive, and it's like you try to read a lot of history books like in a nonfiction way, and it feels like whenever I try to read a history book,
Boring.
yeah, it doesn't. It's flat.
Right.
And it feels like the better way to understand it is to really get into the subjectivity of the characters, like what you've done, and just like allow us to really enter into that world.
Yeah.
Rather than just look
So
at it.
it really affected somebody.
Yeah.
Right. And you empathize with those people and you're like, oh my gosh. Yeah. And isn't that what novels are for, right? To help you empathize with other human beings. Yeah. Learn stories. It's like time traveling and physical traveling. It's so great. Person traveling. Point of view traveling.
Yeah.
Great.
So last question, I guess. How are you doing in these last 3 months? How have you been doing?
Just today I was saying to a friend, there's the personal, and then there's like the social I'm embedded in, and then there's society. And my actual personal life is really quite fine. I have everything I need and more than my fair share of what I want. I have a nice home. I've got plenty of food. For the first time in forever, my whole life, let's be honest. So my daughter moved out last summer, my last child. So I've got 2 daughters, and then we had a foster daughter living with us, or our goddaughter living with us. So last summer, my daughter moved out, and I have a room. I have an entire room to write in. It's so exciting. So like all that's still in place. I live in a very walkable neighborhood. And so in the time of COVID, I can still take neighborhood walks, and I know my neighbors, and I'll do social distancing walking with them. So all that's lovely. And because I worked from home, it's not like my life is hugely, hugely different.
Yeah.
What's hard about my life is I live in a small co-housing community. There's 3 families, and we're COVIDing together. And one of our people has stage 4 cancer and got diagnosed April 17th. So a month into COVID.
Oh man.
So it really is bringing home the poignancy of life and just how to live in the moment and how to make your best choices towards love, right? Towards love, while there's many things you can't do. And then the same with the world, and between the COVID and the protests and the police violence, and knowing that COVID is going to affect so many people, right? Like so many people's lives are going to be decimated by it. And yet it's such a beautiful thing that collectively, in my paper today, they were saying how many cases would have happened if we'd done nothing. And I saw that at the beginning, and to realize like how beautiful it is that we're all willing to do this thing to save so many people. And I think there's just ways in which as a world, we're gonna feel, when I was a kid, I'm really into Star Trek, and I was like, how do you get from this time to the Star Trek time, right? Where we have collective human liberation. And I always thought, well, you have to have something come from outer space to give us something to bandy together for collective human liberation. And then when this started, I was like, wow, like this is something the whole world is gonna experience and share and talk about. And this is gonna make us feel like us probably in a way nothing else ever has.
Mhm.
And we're not each other's enemies, right? I mean, wars brought a world focused on each other, but in an enemy way. So there is this part of me that's just very hopeful that we're going to have an understanding of us as one human community, connected, and that we need to work on our mutual human liberation and the liberation of, the health of the planet. So I guess I'm kind of hopeful because I guess that's how I am. Yeah.
Well, that was really touching and
Yeah.
beautiful.
Wow.
Thank you.
I can see why you're a writer because I got emotional just by you sharing that.
Oh, yay. Thank you.
So, well, thank you so much, Laila. It was
Yeah,
really
thank you.
a pleasure to have you read.
You're
And
so welcome. Thank you for asking me. What a treat. And I'm glad it's recorded. So that's nice.
yeah. Thanks for coming, y'all.
Yeah.
Thanks for hosting.
Bye, Barbara. Bye, Carol.
Bye. It's great to see you.
See y'all.
See you.
Have a
Bye.
good night.
Thank you. You too.
Good night.
Bye.